I joked that my neighbor should come on my road trip. She said okay, before I'd even finished the sentence, like she'd been waiting for someone to ask. 5 days later, on a highway 3 states from home, I found out exactly what she'd actually been waiting to escape. I need to explain the road trip itself first, because it wasn't originally supposed to involve anyone but me. I'd been planning it for months. 2 weeks off work, no real destination, just a loose route heading west with a list of places I wanted to see, and no obligation to see them in any particular order. I needed it more than I'd admitted to anyone. Work had been grinding me down for the better part of a year, and I'd reached the specific, quiet exhaustion where even good things stopped feeling good. I'd told a few coworkers about the trip, framed it as a well-deserved break, the kind of thing people nod at approvingly, without asking too many follow-up questions. I hadn't told anyone the fuller truth, that I'd started dreading the specific silence of my own apartment in the evenings, that the trip had become less about seeing new places, and more about needing a change loud enough to interrupt a pattern I couldn't quite name yet. Emma lived next door. We'd been neighbors for almost 2 years, friendly in the specific way good neighbors are, the kind of relationship built on borrowed sugar and shared complaints about the building's ancient plumbing, never quite crossing into anything deeper, though I'd always found her easy to talk to whenever our schedules happened to overlap on the shared porch. The night before I left, we ran into each other outside, both of us out for the same reason, a break from apartments that felt too small that particular evening. She'd been sitting on the porch steps already when I came out, a mug of tea going cold beside her, staring out at nothing in particular with an expression I didn't think much of at the time but would understand differently in hindsight. I mentioned the trip, mostly making conversation, and somewhere in describing the route, I said it, half joking, the way you say things you don't actually expect anyone to take seriously. You should just come with me. I want to be honest that I said it without much thought behind it, the kind of line that fills space in a conversation, not a genuine invitation. I fully expected a laugh, maybe a, "That sounds fun, have a good trip," and for both of us to go back inside separately a few minutes later. Instead, Emma looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable crossing her face, and said, "Okay." Just that, no hesitation, no follow-up question about logistics, no laugh acknowledging the joke, just a clean, immediate "okay" that told me, even before I fully processed it, that something more was sitting underneath her answer than a spontaneous yes to a road trip. I could have walked it back easily. I could have laughed and said, "Wait, really?" in a tone that gave her an easy exit if she'd been joking too. I didn't. Some part of me, in that specific moment, recognized that Emma's "okay" hadn't sounded like spontaneity. It had sounded like relief. The particular relief of someone who'd been quietly hoping for an excuse to leave, any excuse, and had just been handed one she hadn't had to manufacture herself. "You're serious," I said, studying her face for any sign of hesitation, any indication she was about to laugh and walk the whole thing back. "Completely," she said, already pulling out her phone to check the time. "Give me 20 minutes to pack." I didn't ask why yet. I understand now that not asking, in that first moment, was probably the right call. Pushing for an explanation right away would have made the whole thing feel like an interrogation instead of an invitation. I just told her the departure time, and 25 minutes later, she was standing outside my car with a single duffel bag, dressed for travel, looking lighter than I'd seen her look in the 2 years I'd known her. A specific, visible lightness that I didn't fully understand the source of yet, but that I found myself hoping, even then, might have something to do with me. We didn't talk much about the why of it during that first stretch of driving. We talked about music, about the podcast she insisted I needed to listen to, about the specific, mundane comfort of highway driving with someone whose silences didn't feel like they needed to be filled. She had strong, specific opinions about gas station snacks, dismissed my playlist within the first hour as aggressively unseasoned, and took over the aux cord with a confidence that told me this trip was already becoming something a little different than the solitary 2 weeks I'd originally mapped out. It wasn't until we stopped for gas about 3 hours in, both of us leaning against the car in a mostly empty lot, the sky starting to go orange at the edges, that she said something that gave me my first real clue. "Thank you for not asking why I said yes so fast," she said, staring out at the empty highway rather than at me. I think I needed someone to just take it at face value for a little while. I didn't push. I just told her the offer to talk, whenever she wanted to, would still be there whenever she was ready. She nodded, something in her shoulders loosening slightly. And we got back in the car and kept driving, the conversation drifting back into easier territory for the rest of that first evening. The call started on day 2, her phone lighting up repeatedly with a contact saved simply as Mom. Each one declined within a few rings, the specific tension in her jaw building with each unanswered call. I noticed it happening without saying anything at first, watching her phone screen light up from the passenger seat, watching her thumb hover over the decline button each time with the same practiced, slightly weary efficiency. By the 4th call, I finally asked, gently, if everything was okay, pulling into a rest stop so we could actually talk without the distraction of the road. She was quiet for a long moment before answering, staring out at the parking lot rather than at me. My parents have been pushing me toward marrying someone for the past 8 months, she said. A family friend's son. Good family. Stable. Exactly the kind of match that makes sense on paper to everyone except me. I've been stalling, making excuses, telling them I need more time, and I think they've finally run out of patience for that excuse. Is that why you said yes so fast? I asked. To the trip? Honestly, yes, she admitted. I think some part of me has been looking for a reason to just physically remove myself from the situation for a while, long enough that I couldn't keep having the same circular conversation with them every single week. You offered me an actual reason to leave instead of just wanting one. I didn't know yet how much pressure was actually building behind those unanswered calls, or how much this trip was about to become something far more complicated than an escape. Over the following 2 days, as the miles accumulated and the conversations grew easier, Emma told me more about the situation she'd left behind. Not all at once, but in pieces, the way people share the things that actually matter. The man her parents wanted her to marry, Daniel, no relation to me despite the coincidence of the name, she joked once, dryly, was, by her own account, perfectly pleasant. Not cruel, not controlling in any obvious way, just entirely wrong for her in a way that was hard to explain to people who kept insisting pleasant and stable should be enough. I keep trying to explain that I don't feel anything when I'm around him, she said, one evening, both of us sitting on the hood of my car at a scenic overlook somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And my mom keeps telling me that feelings fade anyway, that stability is what actually lasts. I don't necessarily disagree with her about feelings changing over time. I just don't think you're supposed to start a marriage already feeling nothing. What happens if you keep saying no? I asked. I don't fully know, she said. I think that's part of what scares me. My parents have never explicitly threatened anything, but there's a specific kind of quiet disappointment they're both very good at deploying, and I've spent my whole life finding it harder to sit with than almost anything else. This trip is the first time in months I haven't had to feel it pointed at me every single day. She told me too about the years leading up to this exact moment, how the expectation had built gradually rather than arriving all at once, small comments over holidays and family gatherings accumulating into something that eventually felt less like a suggestion and more like an inevitability she'd simply been delaying rather than genuinely resisting. I think I convinced myself, for a while, that delaying was the same thing as deciding, she admitted. It's not. I just hadn't figured that out until I was actually far enough away to think clearly about it. I found myself, listening to her, understanding my own impulsive invitation differently than I had at the start. I hadn't just offered her a road trip. I'd accidentally offered her the first real permission she'd had in months to want something different than what was expected of her. On day 4, the calls from her mother stopped, replaced by something that worried Emma considerably more. A call from Daniel himself, the man she was supposedly meant to marry, his number appearing on her screen for the first time since the trip began. She stepped away from our campsite to take it, and I watched her pace slowly along the tree line, arms wrapped around herself, the conversation clearly more difficult than any of the calls from her mother had been. I busied myself with the fire, giving her space, though I could hear fragments of her side of the conversation carrying across the quiet campground, her voice tight, apologetic in a way that made something protective flare up in my chest, even before I knew the details. She came back almost 20 minutes later, visibly shaken, sitting down heavily on the log across from me. He wants an answer, she said. A real one, not another make. I need more time. He said our families have been patient long enough, and he needs to know, definitively, within the week, whether this is actually happening or not. What did you tell him? I asked. I told him I'd give him an answer when I got back, she said. Which is technically true, but I think we both know it's also me buying more time. I don't actually know what to do with yet. Do you know what your answer is? I asked. She was quiet for a long time, staring at the fire we'd built, before finally saying something I don't think she'd fully allowed herself to say out loud until that exact moment. "I think I've known for a while," she said. "I think I've just been too scared of what it costs to actually say it. The disappointment, the conversations, the version of myself my parents have been picturing for years that I'd be permanently disappointing by choosing something else instead." I didn't tell her what to do. I understood, even then, that this needed to be entirely her decision, made on her own timeline, not something I nudged her toward because of whatever I was starting to feel about the person sitting across that campfire from me. I just poked at the fire, letting the silence sit between us without trying to fill it, the way she'd thanked me for doing on the very first day of the trip. That same night, unable to sleep, we ended up talking until nearly dawn, the conversation drifting from her family situation into something more personal, more unguarded than anything we'd said to each other over the previous 4 days. "Can I ask you something?" she said, somewhere past 2 in the morning, poking at the dying fire with a stick out of nervous habit. "Why did you actually invite me? Be honest. I don't think it was really about the joke." I thought about it seriously before answering, wanting to give her something true rather than something easy. "I think I was lonelier than I let myself admit," I said. "I planned this whole trip as this solo clarifying thing, and somewhere underneath that plan, I think I actually wanted company, and you were the person I trusted enough to ask, even if I dressed it up as a joke, so neither of us had to take it too seriously if you'd said no." "I'm glad I didn't say no," she said. "Me too," I said. "More than I expected to be, honestly, given how impulsive the whole thing was." She looked at me for a long moment in the dim firelight, something shifting in her expression that hadn't been there in any of our previous conversations. "I need to say something else," she said. "And I need you to know, it's not about needing an escape anymore. This part isn't about running from anything." "Okay," I said, my pulse picking up slightly, some instinct already telling me where this conversation was headed. "I think I've started feeling something on this trip I wasn't expecting to feel," she said. "Something that has nothing to do with Daniel, or my parents, or any of the pressure I brought with me. Something about you, specifically, that I don't think I can keep pretending isn't there." I didn't have a perfectly composed response ready. I just reached over, in the quiet dark of that campsite, and took her hand, and neither of us said anything else for a long time, the silence carrying more than either of us could have managed in words. We sat like that until the sky started turning gray at the edges, neither of us in any hurry to be the one to break the moment first. The final day of driving home was quieter than the rest of the trip, both of us aware that whatever waited back at our actual lives was going to require real decisions neither of us could keep postponing on a highway 3 states away. We talked less than usual during that final stretch, both lost in our own thoughts, though the silence felt different than the guarded silences of the trip's early days. Comfortable rather than uncertain. The kind two people share when they've already said the important things and are simply letting them settle. Emma called her parents the evening we got back, and I sat in my own apartment, wall away from hers, hearing the muffled shape of a difficult conversation through the thin walls that had made us neighbors in the first place. I didn't ask her about it that night. I let her have the space to process it on her own terms, though I'll admit I barely slept, listening for the tone of her voice through the wall, unable to make out words but able to read the emotional weather of the conversation regardless. She came to my door the next morning, looking exhausted but steadier than I'd seen her in days, still in the same clothes from the night before, clearly having not slept much either. "I told them," she said, "all of it, that I'm not marrying Daniel, that I'd made my decision, and that I needed them to actually hear it this time instead of treating it as another delay." "How did they take it?" "About as well as I expected," she said. "Disappointed." My mom cried. My dad went quiet in the specific way he does when he's upset, but doesn't want to say so directly. But I said it, clearly, and I didn't take it back, which is more than I've managed in 8 months of trying. "I'm proud of you," I said. "I couldn't have said it as clearly if I hadn't had 5 days away to actually hear myself think," she said. "So thank you for the world's most impulsive invitation." "Anytime," I said. "Though I should warn you, I don't think I have another spontaneous road trip in me for at least a few months. This one took a lot out of both of us." She laughed, the first real laugh I'd heard from her since we'd gotten back, and something about hearing it settled a worry I hadn't fully realized I'd been carrying since we'd pulled back into the apartment parking lot the night before. It's been almost a year since that evening on the porch, since a half-joking invitation turned into the trip that ended up reshaping both of our lives in ways neither of us saw coming when I said, "You should just come with me." Emma and I are together now, genuinely, No longer just neighbors trading pleasantries across a shared porch, but two people who found each other by accident on a road trip that was never supposed to include anyone but me. Her relationship with her parents has slowly, imperfectly repaired itself, not without real tension in the early months, but with a foundation now built on honesty rather than the quiet, indefinite stalling that had defined the year before. Her mother, in particular, took the longest to come around, but Emma told me, a few months ago, that her mother had finally admitted, quietly, over a phone call, that she'd rather have a daughter who was honestly happy than one who was politely, permanently disappointed in a marriage that made sense to everyone except her. We still take road trips, though never quite as spontaneously as that first one. We've learned since to plan at least the basics in advance. An adjustment, Emma jokes, is the only sensible thing either of us has done differently since that impulsive night on the porch. We went back to that same overlook, the one where she first told me about Daniel, on the trip's 1-year anniversary, and sat on the hood of the same car, and she told me it was strange, revisiting a place that had once represented so much fear and uncertainty, now that it just felt like an ordinary, happy memory instead. I think about that porch conversation often, how close that entire trip came to staying exactly what I'd planned, a solitary 2 weeks of driving and thinking, if I hadn't said something impulsive I didn't fully mean at the time. I think about Emma's okay, how much certainty was actually packed into that one small word, certainty I didn't understand until days later, watching her finally find the courage to say the same clear thing to the people she'd been avoiding it with for months. I've thought too about how differently things might have gone if I'd walked the joke back that first night, given her an easy exit the way I almost did, and let us both go back inside separately, the invitation forgotten by morning. I don't know what would have happened to Emma's situation with her parents in that version of events. Maybe she'd have found her own way to say no eventually, on her own timeline, without needing a road trip to get there. I just know I'm grateful I didn't have to find out, that some instinct in me recognized her answer meant something, and let the invitation stand instead of quietly retracting it. If there's one thing I've taken from all of this, it's that sometimes the smallest, least deliberate invitations end up mattering the most. Not because we plan them carefully, but because we happen to offer them at the exact moment someone else has been quietly waiting for permission to want something different. I joked about a road trip. Emma heard an escape route she'd been looking for, without knowing how to build it herself. Neither of us expected that joke to become the beginning of an actual life together, and I don't think either of us would trade the accident of it for a version that arrived any more carefully planned than it did. If this one got you, tell me in the comments. And if you want more real stories like this, subscribe. There's a new one waiting for you every week.